The date is November 14th, 1943. The time, just past 3 in the afternoon. The village of Zudosk, in the Pas-de-Calais region of northern France, sits beneath a sky the color of old pewter, low clouds pressing down on the fields like a hand on a wound. The trees have shed everything. The lanes between the stone houses are cold and still. A rooster somewhere calls out once, then falls silent. This is occupied France. There are no unnecessary sounds here. Even animals have learned not to draw attention. Inside a narrow schoolroom on the village's eastern edge, 12 children sit at wooden desks arranged in 2 crooked rows. The school teacher, a woman in her late 40s named Madame Colette Brissard, moves quietly between the rows, her shoes barely making a sound on the stone floor. She sets a small bundle of paper on each desk, a luxury in this season, rationed paper distributed by the local mairie meant for arithmetic exercises. Today she tells the children in a whisper that has become her habitual register since the occupation. They may draw whatever they like. A gift of 1 free afternoon in an otherwise rigid week. The children take to the task with the focused energy only the young can produce. Crayon stubs and charcoal pencils emerge from coat pockets and desk drawers. One boy draws a dog. 2 girls share a pencil and draw a farmyard. A thin boy in a gray wool sweater draws what appears to be a battle scene, soldiers marching, tiny and faceless. Madame Brissard pauses at his desk long enough to place her hand briefly on his shoulder, then moves on. At the back of the room, sitting alone at a desk pushed slightly away from the others, not by punishment but by temperament, a girl of 9 draws in complete silence. Her name is Marguerite Leroux. She is slight, with dark hair cut unevenly, and she draws the way some children do sums, with great concentration, her tongue pressing gently against the inside of her lower lip, her eyes moving between the paper and somewhere else, somewhere only she can see. She is drawing what she sees every afternoon from the window of the loft above her family's barn, where she goes to be alone after school. She is drawing the woods and the hill behind the woods, and what has been happening there for the past 4 months. Madame Brissard collects the drawings at the end of the afternoon and stacks them in a worn leather satchel she carries home each evening, intending to hang the better ones on the classroom wall as decoration. That night, sorting through the stack by lamplight, she pauses at Marguerite's drawing. She studies it for a long moment. Then she closes the satchel, sits back in her chair, and stares at the wall. The drawing is technically unremarkable. The proportions are wrong, as a child's always are. The trees are too large, the hill flattened, the sky suggested only by a few scrawled gray marks. But the content, what is in the drawing, and how precisely Marguerite has reproduced it, is something else entirely. Madame Brissard has lived in this region for 20 years. She knows those woods. She knows the hill. And what the child has drawn on the face of that hill, rendered in careful crayon lines with the unfiltered accuracy of a witness who does not yet understand what she is looking at. Madame Brissard does not know exactly what it is, but she knows it should not exist. And she knows, with the peculiar certainty of someone who has spent 3 years learning to survive under occupation, that someone else needs to see this. She places the drawing inside the pages of a Bible she keeps on the shelf above her writing table. She sits in the dark for a while. Then she goes to bed. She does not sleep. The drawing makes its way through 3 pairs of hands before it reaches the right one. Madame Brissard carries it, still inside the Bible, to a neighbor, a pharmacist named Edouard Planche, who is known in the village to know people who know people. She says nothing specific to him. She simply hands him the Bible, open to the correct page, and tells him that a child drew this yesterday afternoon. Then she leaves. Planche stares at the drawing for a long time without speaking. He turns it sideways, then right side up again. He sets it on his counter beside a row of amber bottles. He goes to the window, checks the street. Then he closes the curtains. Within 8 days, through a chain of contacts so fragile and so precise that a single wrong link would have collapsed it entirely, the drawing reaches a man in Lille who goes by the name Fernand. Fernand is not his real name. He is a courier for a resistance network called Alliance, one of the most active and most persecuted intelligence networks operating in occupied France. He photographs the drawing with a small Minox camera, the negative no larger than a thumbnail, and the original is burned. Within another 10 days, the negative has crossed the channel by way of a fishing trawler running with no lights in the dark of a November night, and the photograph is sitting on a desk in London. The desk belongs to a section of British military intelligence that in the autumn of 1943 is almost entirely consumed by a single problem: what the Germans are building across northern France and what it is intended to do. The intelligence officer who first examines the developed photograph is a man named Squadron Leader Thomas Hendry. He is 31 years old, a former surveyor from Edinburgh, who joined the RAF and ended up in analysis because he had, his superiors noted, the ability to look at an image and see past it. He sits at his desk in a basement room on Victoria Street, under a single overhead lamp, and places the photograph beside a magnifying loupe. He looks at it for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he says quietly, to no one in particular, "Good God." He reaches for a second photograph, an aerial reconnaissance image taken 2 weeks earlier by a Spitfire flying at 30,000 feet over the Pas-de-Calais. He places them side by side. The aerial image shows a patch of forest, a hill, a railway spur, branching off the main line from Saint-Omer. The child's drawing shows a forest, a hill, and something built into the side of the hill, something the trees have been arranged to conceal, something that, from 30,000 feet, is nearly invisible, but which a 9-year-old girl walking home from school through the fields below it every afternoon for 4 months has reproduced from ground level with the unconscious precision of a child who does not know she should be afraid of what she is seeing. What Marguerite has drawn is a series of curved shapes. She has rendered them roughly in overlapping crayon arcs, emerging from the hillside beneath the tree line. Beside them, at an angle she has captured with surprising accuracy given her age, is a long linear form pointing northeast. She has drawn workers in tiny stick-figure lines moving around these structures. She has drawn a fence that curves around the compound, with 2 breaks she has marked as gates. And at the edge of the drawing, where the hill meets the field, she has drawn a train car that is not a train car, or not entirely. It is wider than any passenger carriage, and its top is flat. She has drawn it twice in 2 different positions, as if noting that it moves. Hendry pulls a third photograph from a folder on his desk. It is a captured German document, partial. Its edges burned, recovered from a courier who was intercepted outside Brussels 3 months earlier. The document references a construction program using the word Beten in ways that are not purely architectural. And it uses another word, Versuchsstelle, that translates roughly as experimental site. Hendry taps his finger on the child's drawing, then on the aerial image, then on the burned document. He picks up the telephone on his desk. The person he calls does not work in his building. The conversation lasts 4 minutes. By evening, 3 more people have seen the photograph. By the following morning, it has entered a file that is classified beyond Hendry's own clearance level. And somewhere in a larger office upstairs, someone with more authority and fewer illusions has begun asking questions about what a 9-year-old French girl was watching being built in the hillside above her village. To understand what is hidden in those woods above Zudosk, and why it matters so profoundly that the autumn of 1943 is when it begins to unravel, it is necessary to step back, not far and not gently, into the wider logic of the war. By late 1943, the strategic situation in Western Europe has reached a particular kind of suspended brutality. The Allied landings in Sicily and Italy have begun to bite, but the real confrontation, the crossing of the Channel, the assault on Fortress Europe from the west, has not yet come. Everyone knows it is coming. The Germans know it above all. And in the upper levels of the Wehrmacht and the SES, a question has been asked repeatedly, with increasing desperation. What can be deployed that the Allies cannot bomb, cannot land against, cannot simply outlast with superior materiel? The answer, or the attempted answer, is what the Germans call Vergeltungswaffe, vengeance weapon. The V-1 flying bomb and its successor, the ballistic Vi-2 rocket, are the products of years of secret development, primarily at the research facility at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast, where a team of engineers led by Werner von Braun had been refining the technology since the late 1930s. The RAF had bombed Peenemünde in August 1943 in a massive night raid that killed hundreds of workers and set the program back by months. But the program did not stop. It adapted. What the RAF had bombed was the development facility. What now exists in the fields and hillsides of northern France are the deployment sites, the places from which the weapons will actually be launched. And these sites have been built from the beginning with concealment as their primary design principle. The V-1 launching infrastructure in France takes two broad forms. The first, already being discovered, albeit slowly, by Allied aerial reconnaissance, is what the analysts will come to call the ski site, a characteristic arrangement of long concrete ramps, curved storage buildings, and prefabricated bunkers, arranged in a pattern that, once identified, becomes recognizable from the air. By late 1943, British photo interpreters have identified roughly 96 of these sites across the Pas-de-Calais and Normandy. The distinctive shape of the storage buildings, curved at one end like the runners of a ski, gives them away. The Germans, recognizing that these sites have been compromised, begin work on a second generation, simpler, faster to build, disguised as farm-out buildings or embedded in forest clearings using natural terrain to break up the outlines that aerial photography relies on. But there is a third category, smaller in number and far more significant in ambition. These are the heavy sites, massive concrete structures built not for the V-1 but for the larger, more destructive V-2, and designed not merely to launch missiles but to receive, store, fuel, and deploy them on a continuous industrial scale. These bunkers are not hidden in the sense of being invisible. They are hidden in the sense of being incomprehensible from above. The Germans have wrapped them in forest, cut them into hillsides, and relied on the fundamental limitation of aerial reconnaissance, that it shows the top of things. The side of a hill from 30,000 feet looks like a hill. One of these heavy sites sits in the woods above a small French village in the Pas-de-Calais. Its construction began in the summer of 1943, carried out by thousands of forced laborers working under Organization Taut, the vast German military construction apparatus that built the Atlantic Wall and the Autobahn alike. The workers have been imported: French conscript laborers, Soviet prisoners of war, men from across occupied Europe who are worked to the edge of endurance and housed in conditions the documents do not dwell on. The local French population has been kept at a distance. Roads have been closed, a fence has been erected, and the trees have been tended carefully, not cleared, but thickened along the perimeter, so that what grows at the edge of the forest presents an unbroken canopy to anything looking down. What is being built inside that canopy is a reinforced concrete firing complex nearly 300 meters long, its main chamber designed to house V-2 rockets in a horizontal position for fuel loading before they are raised on mobile platforms and launched through apertures cut into the hillside. The concrete walls are 7 meters thick in places. The structure has been calculated to withstand direct hits from bombs then in production. The Germans believe it to be, for all practical purposes, invulnerable. They are counting on it, not merely as a tactical asset, but as a strategic one. If the Allies land in France, and the Germans know they will, this facility, and others like it, are intended to rain destruction on London, on Portsmouth, on the Channel ports, on whatever concentration of Allied logistics or men presents itself. It is not merely a weapon site. It is a statement about what the war will look like after the invasion begins. And it has been hidden, the Germans believe, from every instrument of Allied intelligence. They have not counted on a child who walks home through the fields every afternoon and likes to draw what she sees. Marguerite Leroux was born in March of 1934, the second daughter of a farmer named Henry Leroux and his wife Sylvie. The family works a modest holding of perhaps 30 hectares on the southern edge of the village. Wheat, sugar beet, a few dairy cattle that have been requisitioned down to 2 by the German administration. A vegetable garden that has become, since the occupation, the most important plot on the property. Marguerite is not a remarkable child in any of the ways that adults tend to notice. She is quiet, does adequately in school, is considered slightly odd by her classmates for preferring her own company to theirs. She does not think of herself as a serious person. She thinks of herself, when she thinks of herself at all, as someone who likes to look at things. She has always been this way. Her mother says it with a mixture of affection and mild exasperation. That girl looks at everything. What Marguerite looks at from the loft window above the barn is the hill. It is perhaps a kilometer distant across the fields, close enough that in clear weather she can make out individual trees. The loft is where she comes after school to be alone, and she has come here every weekday afternoon since September, when the construction beyond the tree line began to produce sounds and activities worth watching. She does not think of herself as watching anything in particular. She is simply there, in the afternoon light, looking, the way she has always looked. What she has seen over 4 months is a gradual transformation. In September, there were lorries, heavy military lorries in considerable numbers, turning off the main road north of the village and disappearing into the gap in the tree line that corresponds to a logging track she has used since childhood. In October, there was sound, concrete mixers, the low groan of heavy machinery, and occasionally, when the wind came from the north, the voices of men shouting in languages she does not recognize, not French, not German. Something else, multiple something elses. There were also lights at night, visible in winter, as a faint orange glow above the treetops when her family went outside to use the privy. In November, she began to see the structures. Not directly, the trees still blocked most of the view, but in the places where the logging track emerged briefly into a cleared strip before re-entering the forest, she could see, when the angle was right and the trees were bare enough, sections of what was being built. The curved shapes, the long ramp-like form tilted at its angle through the gap. The flat-topped rail car she drew twice because it appeared on 2 different days in 2 different positions. She drew it because she found it interesting. The shapes were unlike anything she had seen before. Not like a farm building, not like the church, not like the German barracks in the village square. They were heavy and purposeful in a way she felt without being able to name. She drew them the way she drew everything, from the loft window, in the afternoon, watching carefully. And she reproduced what she saw with the accuracy of a child who does not yet filter observation through assumption, who draws the thing itself, not the idea of the thing. This is the key. Adults who pass the site, the few who are permitted near the perimeter, see a construction project behind a fence in the woods, and their minds complete the picture with whatever familiar category is nearest to hand. A factory, a barracks, a storage depot. Their experience edits out the details that don't fit. Marguerite has no such filter. She draws what is there, not what she expects to be there. The long ramp, the curved bunker, mouths, the rail car with the flat top that is not a rail car for people. She draws it because it is interesting, not because she understands what it means. She has shown the drawing to no one. She has not thought to. It is just a drawing. In the basement room on Victoria Street, the work of interpretation moves slowly, as serious work always does. Squadron Leader Hendry pins the photographed drawing to a board beside the partial aerial image of the site. He works methodically, the way a surveyor works, beginning with what is measurable and moving outward from there. The child's drawing contains several reference points that can be correlated against the landscape. The angle of the hill matches the contour lines on a pre-war French topographic map. The tree line's profile, rough as it is in the drawing, corresponds to the shape visible at the edge of the aerial photograph. The railway spur, present in both, provides a fixed axis from which other measurements can be extrapolated. What the child has drawn at the base of the hill are 3 distinct curved forms. Hendry traces them carefully onto a piece of tracing paper. He compares the proportions to known V1 storage structures, the ski-shaped buildings that photo interpreters have been cataloging across northern France. The proportions are different, too large. The curve is different too, not the elongated C shape of a V1 storage building, but something more massive, more deeply embedded. He makes a note. He sits back and looks at the ceiling. A colleague enters the room, a woman named Diana Marsh, who has spent the past 8 months analyzing captured German engineering documents. He shows her the tracing. She studies it without speaking for nearly 2 minutes, which is a long time for Diana Marsh. Then she goes to a filing cabinet in the corner of the room and extracts a folder. Inside the folder are photographs of a document, not the burned one Hendry has been cross-referencing, but a different one, recovered from a German officer in Italy who had been, rather carelessly, carrying materials outside his operational zone. The document contains engineering diagrams, partial, frustratingly partial, of a structure that the German text describes as a Sonderbauwerk, a special structure. The diagrams show curved walls, they show recessed apertures in a hillside face, they show rail access points with transfer equipment. The curve radius in the German diagram, when Marsh places her ruler against it, matches the radius Hendry has traced from the child's drawing to within a margin he would expect from a 9-year-old working with crayon. There is a silence in the room. Outside, a bus passes on Victoria Street. Someone in the corridor upstairs drops something, and it echoes. The flat-topped rail car, Hendry says. He points to it in the photograph. She drew it twice, Marsh nods. Different positions. She's showing it moves. She taps the German diagram. It's a transfer vehicle for horizontal loading, which means this isn't a launch site, Marsh says. It's a storage and preparation site for the big ones. The distinction matters enormously. A launch site is a transient threat, mobile, replaceable. A storage and preparation facility for V2 rockets buried in reinforced concrete in a hillside is something else. It is infrastructure. It is the mechanism by which the weapon program becomes sustained, operational, capable of continuous use rather than isolated strikes. Destroy the launch sites and the Germans relocate. Destroy a facility like this, and you cut the supply chain at a point that cannot easily be moved. There is doubt, of course. Hendry makes a point of articulating it clearly in the note he writes that afternoon, because this is the discipline his training demands and his conscience requires. The drawing is a child's drawing. The correlation may be coincidence. The curves in the child's tracing may not be accurate. The railway spur may be for conventional supply. They need more. They need another source to corroborate. He sends a message through the networks in France. It takes 12 days to get a response. The response comes not in writing, but in the form of a second photograph, taken at night at great personal risk by a resistance operative who has managed to position himself near the perimeter fence on the north side of the site. The photograph is blurred, underexposed, and taken from an oblique angle through a gap in the wire. But it shows unmistakably a section of curved concrete wall emerging from the hillside, and in the foreground on a section of rail track leading into the structure, the flat top of the transfer vehicle that Marguerite drew twice from her loft window on 2 cold afternoons in November. Hendry adds the photograph to his board. He writes a second note. This one goes upstairs. The confirmation arrives in stages, the way certainty always arrives in wartime, incomplete, contested, revised, and finally undeniable. The site above Zudosk, which the British analysts assign the codename Marmite, for reasons that are purely procedural and entirely unremarkable, is identified in the last week of December 1943 as a Category Schwer installation, a heavy Category V weapon preparation facility. The identification draws on 5 separate intelligence threads: the child's drawing, the nighttime photograph from the resistance, the partial captured German document, a second aerial pass carried out at low altitude by a mosquito flying at dusk in near-suicidal conditions, and a report from a French railway worker who has noted the nature of the specialized equipment being moved by night from the Saint-Omer rail yard, northward along the spur. None of these threads alone is conclusive. Together they become something that Hendry's superior, a group captain named Alderman, who has spent 3 years learning the difference between evidence and pattern, describes in his report as a convergence that goes beyond reasonable coincidence. In plain language, they have found it. The reason the site remained hidden for so long is exactly what the Germans designed it to be, a problem of perspective. Aerial reconnaissance, the dominant intelligence tool of the air war, looks down. The site's most revealing features, the apertures cut into the hillside, the curved bunker openings, the rail access, face outward and sideways. From above, they are invisible beneath the canopy. The Germans had positioned the tree line specifically to address this limitation, planting additional rows of trees along the ridge to prevent any downward line of sight from capturing the hillside face at a useful angle. They had also routed all major supply deliveries by night, used camouflage netting over the rail transfer area, and timed the most visually distinctive operations, the movement of specialized equipment, for overcast days when low-altitude reconnaissance was impossible. What they could not engineer against was a child sitting in a loft window on a clear afternoon, looking at the hill because she found it interesting. The ground-level perspective, the unfiltered gaze, the willingness, the inability, really, to not see what was there. British photo interpreters, once they know what they are looking for and where to look, go back through months of archived aerial photographs and begin to find evidence that had been there all along, misread or unread. A shadow on the hillside that is too geometric to be natural, a line of disturbed soil beneath the canopy, a section of what was logged as agricultural machinery near the wood's edge that, in the new context, is recognizable as construction equipment. The evidence was always visible. The frame for reading it was not. A child provided the frame. The decision about what to do with the Marmite identification is not made in a single meeting or by a single person. It moves through the institutional machinery of the Allied Strategic Air Command, with a particular combination of urgency and caution that characterizes decisions where the cost of being wrong is measured in aircraft and crews, and if the target turns out to be misidentified, in the credibility of the entire intelligence apparatus that produced the assessment. There is a genuine argument made by several officers, including Hendry himself, for leaving the site intact and using it, continuing to monitor it, learning from what the Germans bring there, reading the deployment schedule of a weapon program that has not yet found its full operational footing. This argument is not unreasonable. Intelligence about a weapon you have not yet faced is valuable in proportion to its detail, and a functioning facility is a more instructive target than a destroyed one. The counter-argument is simpler and, in the end, heavier. The Allied invasion of France is planned for the spring or summer of 1944. The V-2, unlike the V-1, cannot be intercepted in flight. A facility capable of preparing and launching rockets on an industrial scale, operational during an invasion period, represents a threat to the logistics of the entire operation, to the channel ports, to the concentration of men and materiel, to the momentum of the landing itself. The mathematics of the decision resolve in favor of destruction. In February 1944, the site is assigned to Operation Crossbow, the Allied strategic campaign against V-weapon infrastructure. The targeting package includes the low-altitude mosquito photographs, the annotated aerial reconnaissance images, and, in the file, though not referenced in the operational orders, a note about the intelligence thread that originated with a child's drawing recovered through the resistance network in the Pas-de-Calais. On the morning of a gray day in late February, a formation of American B-17 flying fortresses crosses the Channel on a heading for northern France. The briefing has been precise. The target is a hillside facility, not a village. The bombs are to fall on the hill above the tree line and into the apertures identified in reconnaissance photographs. The crews have been told the target is an enemy supply installation of high strategic priority. They have not been told more than that. They do not need to know more than that. The bombing is not clean. Bombing is never clean. Several bombs fall wide of the intended impact point into the forest below the target. The rail spur is cut. 2 of the apertures in the hillside are collapsed by direct hits. A section of the main bunker roof is penetrated, remarkable, given the thickness of the concrete, and attributed to the new generation of penetrating bombs that the Americans have been developing specifically for hardened targets. The facility is not destroyed. Facilities this heavily built are not destroyed by a single raid, but it is damaged severely enough that its intended operational timeline is disrupted. The transfer equipment is rendered unusable. The rail access is severed, and the Germans, who had by this point committed substantial resources to the site and incorporated it into their deployment plans for the period following an Allied landing, must revise those plans. No one in the village is told why the bombers came to that particular hill. No one is told about the drawing. Madame Brissard hears the aircraft pass overhead and watches the smoke rise above the tree line from the schoolroom window. She says nothing to the children. Several of them watch with wide eyes. Marguerite, at her desk in the back row, looks at the smoke for a long moment, then returns to the piece of paper in front of her. She is drawing a rabbit. The specific details of what Marguerite's drawing contributed to the targeting of the Marmite facility were not made public during the war, and in the decades after, the operational records were classified, consolidated into the larger archive of Operation Crossbow, and did not emerge in any accessible form until researchers began working through the declassified intelligence files in the 1990s. What they found was a modest but unmistakable paper trail, a photograph of a child's drawing annotated by hand, a tracing overlay on wax paper with penciled measurements, and a 2-page intelligence summary that describes, in careful bureaucratic language, how the convergence of sources that identified the facility was initiated by a juvenile observational report recovered through the Alliance network in the Pas-de-Calais, November 1943. Marguerite Leroux, who had by that time become Marguerite Bertrand, married, living in Amiens, working as a school teacher herself, did not know about any of this until 1997, when a historian researching the Crossbow campaign tracked her down through parish records. She was 63 years old. She listened to what the historian told her and sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, "I just thought the shapes were interesting. This is the line, above all others, that stays with you, not the intelligence reports, not the bomb damage assessments, not the operational calculus of the strategic air campaign." A 9-year-old girl sitting in a loft window in November, thinking the shapes on the hill were interesting enough to draw. And the drawing passing, by chance and courage and the grinding machinery of wartime intelligence, from a leather satchel in a French village schoolroom to a pinboard in a basement in London, and from there into the chain of decisions that reduced a Nazi bunker complex to rubble. The V-2 rocket program was not stopped by this single action. It was not stopped at all in the end. The first V-2s struck London in September 1944, months after the Allied landings. The war's momentum was by then sufficient to contain the damage they could do, but the calculus of those months, what the Germans could deploy, when, at what scale, was shaped by dozens of decisions like this one, each dependent on a thread of intelligence gathered at great risk and processed with meticulous care, each one contributing a fraction of the margin by which the invasion succeeded or failed. What Marguerite's drawing offers, beyond its specific contribution, is something harder to quantify. It is a reminder that the architecture of great events is built from the materials of ordinary life. A child's instinct to notice things, a teacher's instinct that something is wrong, a pharmacist who knows people who know people, a courier running in darkness with a negative the size of a thumbnail sewn into his coat lining, a surveyor turned intelligence officer who places 2 photographs side by side and, for a moment, sees past the limits of what military technology could see. History concentrates into great figures and decisive battles because those concentrations are easier to hold in the mind. But the truth of the thing is more granular, more human, more fragile. It is a 9-year-old girl with a crayon stub and a loft window, and the uncomplicated conviction that the hill is worth looking at. The shapes were interesting. She was right.